Good morning. Hope you're all doing well. So we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday, talking about topological expressivity. But before I get into this, I thought I would, since I do have a few extra minutes, just take a few minutes to say a little bit more about how to apply this whole setup to situations where your inputs are not immediately numbers. So, for example, how does this whole setup apply to like images? So it's just very quick. If you want to do, say, like image, let's say image recognition. So let's say you're looking at digital images. So they're digital. And so they're all, let's just assume they're all the same size. Let's say there's some number of pixels. Let's say they're, I don't know, we'll say they're capital N by N pixels. And let's say you've got a bunch of these images and your question is like, does this image show me a cat? Is this a picture of a cat? Yes, a picture of a cat. So the question is, how do you use this whole setup that we've been talking about to answer a question like this? So our setup is that, right, we have this parameterized class of functions. And these functions go from one Euclidean space to another. Each f theta goes from whatever your input is to let's say r. Right. Okay. So how do we make it fit this whole setup? So the idea is that you need to turn an image into a point in Rn0. So turn an image into a point in Rn0. And then you'll interpret outputs as being like yes or no. So pick a threshold, pick T and R, view values, let's say less than T as answering no, this is not a cat, and view values greater than T or greater than or equal to, I mean, it doesn't really matter. I'll just say greater than T as yes, this is a cat. So it's all just about how do you turn this into a point or a vector. And so for images, let's just imagine this is black, white, or grayscale. So each pixel is grayscale. So it's you can represent it as a number in 0, 1, i.e. a number in the interval 0, 1. Okay, so then what's this picture? Well, it's just a list of n squared numbers in 0, 1. So the idea is you encode your picture, your image, as a vector with n squared entries. Okay. And so then you can do this whole training thing. So you get a bunch of these images, you have a human go through them, and you say, this one's a cat, that one's a cat, and that one's a cat. The rest are not. And then you interpret those labels as being like a suitable output value. And then you train your whole neural network. And then the hope is when you give it a new photo that's n by n pictures, that it will be able to detect whether or not it is a cat. So the crux of it is just whatever your input is, you just need to find a clever way of turning it into a vector. I thought also I'd just like briefly say like, okay, so how does this setup apply to like language? And it's really, again, it's just the same game, that whatever your input is, you just need to find a clever way of turning it into a vector. So how about language? Or how about, let's say, sentences? So again, let's say maybe your goal is to predict the next word in a sentence. So let's say, so the example is, given a phrase, predict the next word. So maybe my phrase is, math is really blank. And I want to train some model that will tell me what word goes in the blank. So what do you need to do? All you need to do is figure out some way of turning sentences into vectors. And there's lots of ways to do this. In fact, the whole field of natural language processing this field it's a very rich and deep field. I'm by no means an expert, but you want clever, sort of like useful techniques or ways to turn sentences into vectors. So the simplest, an example of a way to do this, a simple example is called bag of words. And so I'll tell you what bag of words is. This is like the simplest, well, I don't know if it's the simplest, but it's a very, very simple way of getting some vector. So you have let's say there are K words in whatever language you speak are in the language. K is probably a very big number. So if you look at your sentence, you can go through it and count how many times each word happens. And so you just count how many times each word is in a sentence. And then you turn this into a vector with K entries. i.e. an element of R to the K. Then when you need to figure out what word comes next, think of that as, well, a basis vector of R to the K. And so what you need to do is train a neural network where the input is R to the K and the output is also, well, a basis vector in R to the K. So this is obviously like probably not the best way to encode words as vectors, right? Because it ignores like where words are positioned relative to other words, it ignores lots of things, but it just gives you an idea of like how you might start to turn words into vectors. Okay, so I just wanted to mention like these two examples because I think some of the questions I was getting when I was talking to people yesterday was like kind of about sort of how this setup applies. So yeah, any questions or thoughts, or anyone want to add anything? Yeah.
Are there things, subjects that are hard to in the ways?
Yeah, I mean, like this whole field of natural language processing is a huge field with like a lot of really, really smart people working in it, and I honestly know very little about it. But so I think, yeah, there's many things that are, I'm sure, difficult. I don't know too much about that, but right, the question is, how do you encode it in a way that's like useful? And I don't know, does anybody in the audience want to? Does anybody in the audience know? Are there things that are particularly hard to encode? I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So now that I've just mentioned this. Let me return to our talk from yesterday. So remember, the question was, or the big question was, like, how do you pick a class of functions to try to play this game in? In other words, how do you pick an architecture? And so the approach of this sort of collection of ideas was looking for topological constraints about which functions can do what and which architecture these functions live in. So we talked about boundedness yesterday. So we saw one theorem. Let me just briefly go through it. Right. So like we saw an example of a theorem where there is a constraint on the architecture, and you can turn that into a constraint on the topology of the sublevel sets. Okay. And that's kind of where we ended yesterday. I did not give a proof. If you do want to see the proof, I recommend this article. Deep skinny neural networks are not universal approximators. You might remember in the first lecture, I said there's like this universal approximation theorem, which said that if your architecture is arbitrarily complicated, you can approximate any function. So I think what this title is highlighting is that not all architectures can do everything. So I think lots of other things are possible in the same direction. Like, this is not a particularly useful lemma, but it's kind of in the same direction, something I proved, which is that if you have the particular architecture n plus 1, 1, decision regions, which are those either sublevel, superlevel, or like boundary sets, can have at most one connected component. But I think a lot more like this should be possible. So here's like an example of an open question, which I offer to you. Hopefully, I'd love it if someone worked on this. How many unbounded connected components can a decision region of a function in some specific architecture have? I think there's lots of ways you could elaborate on this question. Okay, great. So moving down our list of like topological properties, boundedness is maybe a nice first one. But how about Betty numbers? So let's rephrase this question in terms of Betty numbers. How does the architecture of your family of neural networks constrain the Betty numbers of the sublevel sets? And there's a growing body of work on this topic. I've listed authors of a couple different papers. I'm going to talk right now about this one from 2024 by Grillo. It's called Topological Expressivity of ReLU Neural Networks. Okay, so the definition here that Grillo formulates of topological expressivity of a particular neural network, and again, we're talking about neural networks of this particular type. So they have ReLU activation function, and they're like fully connected. It is for each index j of like homology groups, you look at the sublevel set where the threshold is 0, and you compute the Betty number of that set. So if you're not familiar with Betty numbers, it's the rank of the homology group. Right, so this is like, if it was H1, it would be like number of loops, H2, number of spheres, they're not contractible, and so on. So yeah, just use 0 as the threshold, and then so define beta of f to be just the list of all of the different Betty numbers of this sublevel set. So there's like beta 0 of f, that's like number of connected components, and so on. And in this case, I'm using the notation from this paper in which the domain is r to the d. I've been using r to the n0 up until now, but I'm switching. Now I'm using r to the d. So these Betty numbers, you only need to record them up until d minus 1. Why is that? Well, so where does this set live? It lives in R to the D. So can you have higher homology groups? No, they're all going to be trivial. Okay. So you just record them all. Okay, great. Really strong topological information. So how does the architecture, what constraints does the architecture place on these numbers? So if you ask this question, there's kind of two ways to go about it, right? One way is you can try to construct examples of functions that have really complicated sublevel sets with really complicated topologies. So that's to try to argue that complexity can be high. Of course, the other way is to try to argue that there's upper bounds on the topological complexity. And so in this paper, which I think is really cool, he kind of does both, goes at it from both directions. So I'll start with the construction. So there's a theorem. It says fix an architecture. So it starts with dimension D. It ends up in dimension 1. That's like has some constraints on what type of architecture it is. In this case, all these intermediate ones are at least 2 times the input dimension. Okay, and then there's some quantities. There's some quantities, but the point is he constructs a specific neural network of this architecture that has Betty numbers that are these numbers. Yeah. So I don't know. What are those? I don't know. You can work through it exactly, but the point is that like you can make these numbers be big. So a corollary is, and in fact, if you only use one hidden layer, so D, N1, and then 1, if you make that N1 big enough, you can make these this list of the Betty numbers as big as possible, or as big as you want, in like every single coordinate. And so he just has a construction that actually, yeah, comes up with one of these neural networks. I don't actually know the details of the construction. It's in his paper, so feel free to check it out. It's not clear if this construction is the best possible. In fact, it's probably not. So this probably could be tighter. But this is a game that you can play. Like, how do I build neural networks that efficiently realize a lot of topological complexity? All right, so that's the trying to build up complexity game. On the flip side, you can try to look for obstructions to topological expressivity. So, this is like you'd want to prove theorems that say, for this architecture, you can only get functions whose Betty numbers are, whatever. He proved this theorem. Again, there's like a bunch of numbers, but right, what does it say? It says, let F be a ReLU neural network of this architecture. Then the 0th Betty number is bounded by something, and the other Betty numbers are also bounded by something. Okay, and like, what is this something? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But for now, like, this is some quantity, and I'm just going to call it star, the green star. This is saying actually what some of these things are. J is some quantity. S, so there's an S here. S is the dimension of the lineality space of a refinement of the canonical polyhedral complex. Let me just say briefly what it is. So you guys remember the canonical polyhedral complex? So if you have a complex that looks like, say, if your complex looks like some other complex cross R to the L, so it's like a lower dimensional complex cross unbounded dimensions, then L is called the dimension of the lineality space. It's like the unbounded directions. Okay. Okay, so I'll come back to like what these is, but the point is you're trying to narrow in on this from like two sides. You're trying to construct things, and then you're trying to find obstructions. So let me tell you a little bit about what this proof is. So this upper bound is built off of an upper bound proven by a different collection of people that bounds the number of top dimensional cells in that polyhedral complex. So a theorem, due to this list of authors, which in turn builds on other work by other people, says that that quantity that I called a green star is n upper bound on the number of top dimensional cells of that polyhedral complex. So remark, this is probably, well, who knows, but I don't know, it might not be tight. Again, this is like a construction, or yeah, it's some sort of result. So, anyway, is this bound tight? I don't know. Okay, so the way this theorem that we're just talking about, the one that bounds the Betty numbers, the way it's proven in this article is that you start with this bound on the number of cells, and we're going to use that to bound the number of, to get bounds on the Betty numbers. So here's like a sketch of how it's done in this particular paper. So you start with your polyhedral complex. I'll use P because I'm following the notation from the paper. So canonical polyhedral complex. And we're looking at sub-level sets defined by threshold 0. So let P negative just be the complex where the function is negative. Let P sub K be the set of k-dimensional polyhedra of P. Okay, so there's a couple steps. Step 1 is to prove this claim. The number of k-dimensional cells is bounded by something, and that something is the number of top dimensional cells, choose n minus dk plus 1. So how do you prove this claim? So the first thing you note is that k-dimensional cells are faces of the top dimensional cells. And to get a k-dimensional cell, k-dimensional cell, these faces are the intersections of top dimensional cells. And how many of them do you need? Well, you need that many of them, right? Because like each time you intersect two top dimensional cells, it like decreases the dimension by 1. Okay, so each k-dimensional cell is an intersection of this many top dimensional cells, and we have a bound on the number of top dimensional cells. It was this star number. So star choose this quantity is going to be the number of ways to pick the appropriate number of top dimensional cells to intersect to get a k-dimensional cell. Okay, so the step 1 was passing from bound on the number of top dimensional cells to the number of k-dimensional cells. Okay, step 2, pass to a polytopic complex. And if you remember from yesterday, a polyhedral set can be unbounded. A polytopic set is one that is bounded. So our canonical polyhedral complexes are decompositions of the whole domain. It's kind of hard to work with, much nicer to work with bounded polytopes. So we want to go from a polyhedral complex to a polytopic complex. And so there's an argument about how you can do that. You can construct a homotopy equivalence from the places where the function is negative, to a bounded CW complex, so that the number of K cells is, well, it's bounded by the number of K cells in the original complex plus the dimension of the lineality space. I'm not going to go into any details here, but just the point is shrink this unbounded thing to something bounded, and you can do it in a way that controls the number of cells you get. Okay? And then step 3, basically assume you've done this. So you've got, let's say C is a polytopic complex so that the underlying set is contractible. And then you've got a subcomplex of X. So that's like places where the function is negative. You can argue that the kth Betty number of this set is bounded above by the number of k plus 1 dimensional polyhedra in like the positive part. I'm not going to prove this. It's a long proof using cellular homology. But we've now seen the three steps. We had a bound on the number of top dimensional cells. We turned that into a bound on the number of k-dimensional cells. And then we turned that into a bound on the kth Betty number. It's lovely, and I'm not able to explain it to you at the moment, but it's in this paper. So that's how this particular result goes. I think it's really cool. It's worth pointing out that it is probably not tight, right? Because you start with some bound on the number of top dimensional cells. You argue, you argue about this, right? Then you argue about this. And so you're just doing all these sort of bounds. So right now there's a gap between, at least in this paper, the construction and the upper bound. Oh, maybe I didn't put that here, but right. So question, can you do this better or more efficiently? Questions so far? Okay. How much time do I have left? Is there goodness. Okay, great. All right, so part 3. So another, obviously, like great set of tools from topology is Morse theory. We're talking about piecewise linear functions. So maybe we can apply a piecewise linear version of Morse theory to try to answer some of these questions. So this is something I worked on for a while. And so what we did was like build a version of PL Morse theory, we enhanced a version of PL Morse theory that was created by, I'd say, Grunerich, Kuhnel, and Roth. So I'll just briefly say a couple words about PL Morse theory. I know you all know a lot about discrete Morse theory, which is probably very applicable. Right, so in classical Morse theory, your functions are smooth, and like the sort of founding paradigm is that the homeomorphism class of a sublevel set can only change when you go across a critical point. So that is where the gradient of your function vanishes. For piecewise linear functions, we no longer have quite this nice setup. So the analog of a critical point is a flat cell. So a cell in your polyhedral complex where the function is constant. So I guess, right. So the classical picture would be you have like this like nice smooth function and it has 2 critical points. But in our PL world, we're looking at functions that look like, I don't know, maybe like this. So what are the flat cells? This is meant to be flat. There's 3 0 cells that are flat, and this is meant to be a flat 1 cell. So what I learned is that piecewise linear Morse theory is really hard. And it's very, very subtle, kind of related to this issue of the fact that flat cells can be positive dimensional. And there's not really an obvious way to perturb a piecewise linear function to kind of get rid of the problematic cases. I mean, you can obviously you can destroy this flat cell, but maybe in higher dimensions it gets a little more complicated. So, so here's a theorem that if you have a function from Rn to R that's piecewise linear with finitely many pieces, if you fix thresholds A and B, as long as the part of the polyhedral complex that corresponds to where the function is in the interval AB contains no flat cells, then the sublevel sets associated to threshold A and threshold B are homotopy equivalent. So this is just exactly this it's just the statement in classical Morse theory that your topology can only change when you cross critical cells. In the piecewise linear world, it's that it can only change when you cross flat cells. So this had already been established for polytopal complexes in this work by Grunert, Kuhnel, and Roth. And so really the only thing that I and my co-authors did is we extended this to polyhedral complexes. So essentially the idea is, right, you start with a polyhedral complex and you just squish it down to a polytopal complex in a very controlled way, and then you apply the existing results. Okay. So once you've got this allows you to define for any flat cell or connected component of flat cells, where let's say the function takes on the value t, like the local, what we called homological complexity of that cell. So that's basically like as your threshold, maybe if this is my cell, this flat cell, right? As your threshold passes that level, how does the topology change? So you can define that. We called it the local H complexity of the cell, which we defined it to be the rank of the relative homology of the pair. So F, this is the sublevel set associated to threshold T, and this is same thing, but take away K. So if you're not familiar with relative homology, basically, informally, what it is you take your space F less than or equal to T, and you just form a quotient by collapsing everything outside of a neighborhood of K into a point. So it's like, essentially it's saying like, how does that K, how does that cell K like change the topology? So anyway, yeah, that's what that's getting at. And then you could define the total H complexity to be the sum of all the local H complexities, right? So like as you're moving your threshold, you know, there's like some complexity that you get from this one. Keep going, there's like some complexity you get from this one. Like, you kind of add it all up. So a remark is that piecewise linear maps are really delicate. I already mentioned this. Like a problem that we were running into is that these flat cells might have positive dimension, or, you know, might look like saddle points, and there's like not a natural way to turn it into a function that is like PL Morse. So here's a definition of PL Morse. A map is PL Morse if you look at every point, a neighborhood of every point is like nice. So PL regular means that you can choose coordinates so that the map just looks like f of something is like a constant plus those coordinates. And then non-degenerate critical means you can choose coordinates where like basically it's a constant, and then in some directions the function goes up, and in other directions the function goes down. So in particular, this does not work when you have flat cells of positive dimension. So the sad thing is that a lot of neural network functions are not PL Morse. It happens with positive probability. And we had hoped that we could prove architecture-induced constraints using this notion of complexity. But this unfortunate fact is sort of like a no-go result. So we got a couple little results out of it. Yeah. Yeah.
So, sure that architecture is likely to form, so they go, well, that's great.
Is the Morse function?
What is the likelihood because we know that the space of neural network functions that I'll show you.
Mm-hmm.
One
Yeah. 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 But, so I think Greg's point is great, that the functions you get after training are special in some way. And I guess the obstacle to what you're suggesting is that we don't know what that special way is. So like the first step would be we'd have to like really understand something about what gradient descent does in order to prove theorems. But generally you're saying like, well, why don't we look at a class of nice functions? Yeah, that's totally valid. I don't know. It's a great question. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, I think I sent you the old version of my talk, maybe. I added more to it last night. That's okay. I remember what I was going to say. I'll write it on the blackboard. So I was going to add something that I learned from Rolando Nunez. Is Rolando here? No, he's not here. Oh, no. Okay, well, I learned, so one of the great things about going to math conferences is you learn new things. And so he told me a little bit yesterday about a paper that he and some of his co-authors had written, and I wanted to mention it. Okay. So I don't know what section that was. I think that was 4. Let me call this 5. So this was like a way to bring TDA into this whole picture. TDA to understand how the layers of a neural network act topologically. So the idea is, I should say, this is based on Rolando's work, which I am obviously not an expert in, so I encourage you to talk to him about it. He and some co-authors did the following. So you've got a neural network. And so on. So you can just pick a point cloud in Rn0. So pick, let's call it S, a point cloud in Rn0. Okay, so you can make a persistence diagram for this point cloud. Let's make a persistence diagram. I'll call it persistence diagram 0 because it's in the 0th layer. Okay, now let's map S forward. Now we've got the set F1 of S. We can make a persistence diagram for that. And then map it forward again. Make a persistence diagram. And so on. So you've got like a sequence of persistence diagrams. So I gather from reading and talking to him yesterday. And so you can ask, how do these persistence diagrams change from layer to layer? And so he and his collaborators did an experiment where they implemented a very computationally efficient way of analyzing how quickly these things change for a trained neural network. Yeah, so one of the things he was telling me yesterday is that in his experiment, they found that essentially the number of one cycles kind of stays constant throughout these different layers in the experimental setup that he was doing. So he's looking at a trained neural network, and it's a particular architecture of trained neural network. It's one called an autoencoder, where the picture, an autoencoder is one of these guys where it starts off really big. Here's n0, and it gets smaller until it's like really small, and then it gets big again, maybe back to rn0. So here's like n1, n2. And so the point is it like gets small and then gets big. And so somehow, and you train it to represent the identity function. And so this is some way of like picking out the trained thing of this form, like picks out somehow, well, it's like reducing complexity because you're taking sort of a high dimensional thing and you're passing it through sort of a low dimensional space and then expanding it again. So they were looking at this architecture and had done some really cool experiments. And I'm not going to try to summarize his experiments more than I've already said, but I encourage you to check in with him because I think this question of like, how do the layers act topologically is really cool. And I think the dream would be to say something like the early layers, try to get the right, maybe looks like low-level homology, and the later layers, the right, like higher-level homologies, or something of that kind of form. Yeah. So I'll just write down the question. So how? Well, I guess I kind of already wrote it. How do the layers act topologically? And so this is related to the question, like what topologically do the layers learn? Okay. Great. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, this is the one. My fault. So this is kind of the recap of this like third sort of topic, topological expressivity. So just kind of summing up. So sort of motivating question is which architectures have functions which can do what? And by do what, I mean like what can they express? And can we use topology to express these constraints? We've seen that there are various topological notions of complexity, like ranks of homology groups. We can talk about persistence diagrams, how quickly they change, in which ways they change, boundedness, numbers of cells, and so on. I didn't discuss this much, but I did think I should say that most of this discussion has not involved training. So, I mean, so a really like vague, big topic is like, how do the trained models differ from just a randomly selected model? Like, are their topological properties different? I think that's kind of what Greg was asking. Yeah. And yeah, we've seen that there's some promising results and there's lots and lots of open questions. And I also wanted to like conclude this section by reminding you that there are many different types of neural networks. You can use different activation functions. You can use layer maps that are like a little bit different. And so there may be some like different theories and different techniques that are like particularly applicable to different types of neural networks. Everything we've been talking about is like polyhedral because we're using ReLU activations. Okay. I have 13 minutes left. Yeah, let me introduce my next topic, topic 4. I'm going to do this by chalk. Or yeah. Yep. I personally have not done this. I think there are maybe a few people or various people working on it, but there's definitely like, yeah, room for more. Yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
You have an example of very level level it's involved with these nice drawings. Because you have nice drawings about the topology.
Yeah. Like, has this actually been useful? Yeah. Right. I think that's a great question. So, I mean, yeah, I guess what I can say is I don't think these theorems that I've mentioned yet are like probably really changing the life of anyone who actually tries to train these things for a living. In part because a lot of like the really big models use more complicated architectures. Like ChatGPT does not use a feed-forward ReLU neural network. It's got pieces that look like this, but the whole thing also includes layers that are something a little bit more complicated. So I guess the way I view this is that like the theory is still only for these like sort of like toy examples, and that we need to keep building the theory so that we can like get to the place where it's like actually useful. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah. Sure.
But I thought that the activation function that was more common was the sigmoid. And well, I'm just curious, why did you choose to work on with that?
Why this one? Yeah. Yeah, sigmoid, the sigmoid activation, which is right smooth, certainly is useful. So we started thinking a lot about this one mainly because we talked to people who actually do this for a living, and many of them told us, yeah, we use PL, we use ReLUs. I think mathematically, the PL situation is nice because it gives you something you can like grab onto. You know, when everything's smooth, everything's kind of like really like fluid, and it's just like a little harder to grab, prove things about. The other thing is that in computer science, really everything is piecewise linear. So let me say, everything is, in some sense, piecewise linear. What do I mean by that? Well, if you have like a smooth function like this, if you're a computer, are you really going to be able to tell the difference between like the value of the function here and the value of the function here? No. So, I mean, right, because computers use finite amounts of information, right, like finite floating decimals. So in some sense, like this also is a piecewise linear function from the point of view of like implementation. You know, like maybe a computer might think of it as like this, and then like this, and this, and this. Maybe it has a lot of pieces, but in some sense, it's like, it is still piecewise linear. So maybe we can like prove things about piecewise in the piecewise linear setting, and then view these smooth settings as like just sort of blurring your vision a little bit. Other questions? Yeah.
Are these functions analyzed for both supervised and unsupervised learning?
Great question. So I've only been talking about supervised learning, obviously. Right. So unsupervised learning is kind of a different setup. Right. So what makes this supervised is the fact that the data that we feed into our algorithm, our training process, comes with a label, that label YI, like what it's supposed to be. The unsupervised regime is kind of a different setup. Instead of telling you what specific outputs you should have for specific inputs, you program instead like some other kind of goal. And the training process is a little bit different. So instead of training like, does it match here, and does it match here, and does it match here, you have some more complicated training objective. I don't know as much. I really don't know very much about unsupervised learning. I would imagine that many of the same questions can be asked, but I don't myself know much. I don't know if anybody in the audience knows much about unsupervised learning. Yeah. Yeah, do you want to say anything? No. Yeah. Okay. So there's like 7 minutes left of this session. Why don't we stop here? We can have a slightly longer break, and then I'll go on to the fourth topic later this morning. All right.